Hello, everyone. As you all know, my name is Jack Swab. I'm a new faculty member at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville in their geography department. Um, I am very new to the role, so new that when I was submitting my abstract for NACIS back in May, I didn't have a job. And so I thought I was going to be able to do things that I wasn't fully able to do. So what we'll be talking about today is a little bit speculative is not quite the right word, but a bit theoretical. So there won't be very many empirical things. That being said, if any of you start to nod off, I will call you out. No, I'm kidding. It is after lunch after all. So, whether we like it or not, cartography is deeply wedded to the larger field of geographic information science. The name of this field has its origins in the 1990s when academics argued that we needed to move from GIS, as in Geographic Information Systems, that is the soft and hardwares that allowed us to map things, to GIS, as in Geographic Information Science, or the intellectual pursuit about how we go about mapping things. In the process of moving from geographic information systems to geographic information science, we inadvertently introduced a new phrase, that is, information science, into the realm of what the study of GIS is supposed to do. Information science, which emerged in the 1950s and the 1960s as its own field, emerged in response to the development of early forms of computing, which required robust data management plans to reproduce the same results consistently. And indeed, one of the first professional societies for information science was initially named the American Documentation Institute. Sounds like a type of organization I would like to join, referencing the importance of creating efficient, reproducible methodologies to transform and arrange data. For GISers of the 1990s, and I chose GISers specifically because you don't hear that word very often anymore, the idea was to replicate some of these urges to move us from learning about how to operate software to learning about how to think geocomputationally. And in the years since then, GI scientists have approached information science from a scientific perspective, much in the same way that information scientists work to collect or reformat or reparse data. GI scientists work to do the same thing with a focus on geographic data and the special attributes that geographic and spatial data have. This joint connection between geography and information science has grounded much of the research that allows us to work and visualize spatial data today, not only in the tools that we use to make maps, regardless of who is creating them, but also in how we envision the work that maps do in the world. However, these ideas wed us as cartographers to interpret our understanding of cartography through the lens of GI science. That is, we borrow theories from more computational parts of GI science to make our more representative GI science, what I think all of us in this room would call cartography, occur. So the question that I want to pose is, what does an explicitly cartographic form of information science look like? From the cartographic perspective, these sorts of ideas are not new and have really been present in our field for quite some time, whether that be all the way back to the map communication model, to the map use cube, to many of the things that are going on today. Cartographers have been scientifically thinking about information science for use in cartographic communications for decades. And indeed, I would note that we find ourselves at the annual meeting of NACIS, that is the North American Cartographic Information Society, and not something like NAMS or the North American Map Society. Well, I've yet to discover why the individuals who founded NACIS in 1980 went with the phrase cartographic information, and if anyone in this audience knows, please let me know. One imagines that this phrase was chosen not only to capture the diversity of visualizing geographic information, but also to capture the diversity of how that information was being used. And we see this in what I think might be the first NACIS logo from 1981, coincidentally held in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a place that has, over the past few months, become quite dear to me. If you've ever visited, happy to commiserate. Which urges us to move out of the past and into the future, presumably to a future where cartographic information was better understood. The issue is that it seems that there's been ambiguity about what the phrase cartographic information actually means. A quick Google search for the phrase cartographic information yields 3 general results. The first is a listing for quote-unquote cartographic information centers, that is, things like map libraries, data repositories, and the like. All things that are part and parcel of how we make maps or how we reference maps after they're made, how we end up storing them. The second set of listings is for all of us in this room, that is, NACIS and all the wonderful things that we do. The metadata, in our title of cartographic information ends up meaning that all these ideas come up to the surface. And the third set of listings brings us back to ideas about the map communication model from the 1960s. But what about a search for perhaps just cartographic information science? Here the results are even thinner, comprising a single page of results and just 7 scholarly articles using the phrase. Even ChatGPT, the oracle of all, the all-seer, cannot really pin down what cartographic information science is. Clearly, there's not much here under this formal label. Now, of course, there is plenty of work in cartography and GI science that has addressed these ideas under different names and frameworks. But if cartography is both an art and a science, a mixture of theory and practice, of map makers and map users, it seems that we might have a better understanding of how maps get used far beyond the bounds of our intentions. And so here it's important to note that I'm viewing this relationship through my parallel training in library science, which I should say I have a degree in library science in addition to my degree in geography. And I see the relationship between library science and information science in my mind that there's a similar relationship between the two. Much in the same way that cartography and GI science are related, so too is library and information science. Cartography and library science were both practiced for generations. Before GI science and information science came along. Cartography and library science both continued to be applied disciplines, but training is often in tacit knowledge and practices. And both cartography and library science are the entree for the general public into a much broader world of how humanity sees and represents the world and how humanity manages its information. Stated another way, we might think about this from the perspective of the librarian. The librarian does more than just push around library carts or reshelve books or shush people or assist patrons in finding the information that they need. Rather, they find themselves pulled in a variety of ways, often acting as frontline social workers, providing basic information theory, providing community and guidance for those who need it most. And while librarians are grappling with increases in these sorts of tasks in an increasingly neoliberal world, fundamentally these are aspects of the job which have existed for generations. Information scientists are not helping necessarily the most vulnerable people in our society on the front lines. It's librarians and library science theory which is doing that. Our maps do the same. Oh, I need to change the slide. Sorry. Our maps do the same thing. We may construct them to be read easily for a specific use or with specific intentions, but once our maps are out in the world, how they are used is not up to us as cartographers. Moreover, since our maps cannot speak to us, nor for that matter can they shush us, this means that we have to study how maps are used in different ways and critically through different methods. We are fundamentally looking at the role of practice here. Practice and how a map user might be widely using our maps in contexts far beyond what we can imagine. And here the scientific aspects of GI science melt away in their utility, opening the door to a new way in which we conceptualize how maps are used. This is what I argue constitutes a spatial information practice. That is a turning of attention from cartographic research to focus on map use beyond the map to account for and emphasize in a grounded way the way in which maps, map-like objects, spatial imaginaries, and geographic information are used to help individuals navigate the world. So here I want to pull from scholars not only in critical cartography but also in non and more than representational cartography to build on ideas of the map as more than just mere representations of the world around us. If we want to account for a more holistic view of how our maps are used, we have to account for our practices of using maps far beyond their original intent. Much in the same way that critical cartographers have shown us that maps have multiple meanings, have multiple contested and changing meanings, so too do map uses. At the same point, I have budding interest in mental maps and critical wayfinding studies, which might fit in this framework. I'm still thinking about these, so I'd love to hear your comments. But I think that these are cartographic methods that, through which these things can be explored. My goal is to think through the items on the left through the theories from human geography on the right, that is specifically queer and feminist geographies. And so now that I've established the theoretical basis for what I'm envisioning, I want to turn to 3 potential areas where I might conduct this work, all loosely centered around the guise of health mapping. The first area I'm potentially interested in mapping is access to reproductive health care. This is obviously a consensus issue that expands beyond just abortions to all other forms of healthcare centered around reproduction. This access is increasingly variegated across space, time, and an individual's positionality. Here, I'm not necessarily interested in mapping the transportation geographies of how an individual gets from point A to point B to access this healthcare, but rather envision how individuals are working to navigate through their personal geographies through maps and other forms of spatial information. I think that this map from the New York Times, oh good, it's going, is especially telling. It's part of a larger article that highlights the variegated geographies of access to abortion, and it shows how far individuals are traveling to get access. At the same time, the flows here, that is, the individual arrows, obscure how individuals are making these navigation decisions. It's only in the article itself, that is, the textual reporting on the part by the journalists, that we get an understanding of how individuals are using geographic information, including maps, to make decisions about how and where to get access to reproductive health care. So there's a need not only to think about how these individuals are making these decisions, but also how we might visualize them in novel ways. I envision that a similar sort of approach could be undertaken with access to gender-affirming care. Similar to access to reproductive health care, the decisions an individual needs to make are variegated across space, time, and an individual's positionality. I'm not going to go into this too much, but there are a lot of parallels between these two areas. At the same point, I'm also interested in working to understand and visualize. Oh, there we go. There's that slide. Okay. Working to understand and visualize the spatial imaginaries of unhoused individuals. Unhoused individuals are not only highly mobile across urban areas, but also face significant geographic and communicational challenges related to healthcare access. How do unhoused individuals manage their healthcare spatially? How is spatial information spread across the community when access to phones, access to electricity, and things like that can be limited? What I hope I've outlined here through a very theoretical and speculative, definitely not grounded path, is to forward support cartographic research into map use that is centered around embodied understandings of real-world map uses. So, at this point, it's time for a little bit of promotional work. So if you found this topic interesting, or if you found any of these other topics interesting, or if there's a topic that's not on here that you find interesting, and I don't know, maybe you want to come to Knoxville, you want to support the volunteers, you want to be where the TVA is, I don't know, who knows why you would want to be there. Chat with me afterwards, send me an email. We've got funding for grad students. I'm really looking forward to working with grad students on cartographic topics and helping kind of advance these more humanistic sides of understanding cartography. All right, well, with that, that's that. Thank you very much.
We do have time for 1 or 2 questions. Going once, going twice. All right, thank you so much,
you.
Jack. That was fantastic.